right? I mean, do you remember back during uh, the campaign season when J.D. Vance said that America is not an idea, it's a place, and the firestorm of controversy that created? I've actually been saying that for years, and it's on grounds. I mean, it's quite possibly that it's a place governed by a deeply flawed idea, actually, or an idea that's been corrupted in this or that or the other way.
Join the best in the movement. It's conservative conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Dr. Hanby, thank you for joining me. It's great to be with you. I feel like this conversation's been a long time coming. Stuff that we talked about one-on-one and with our students at the Rhetoric and Debate Summer School that ISI hosted last summer. And the stuff's about like liberalism and political philosophy, the meaning of America. I have no idea where this conversation will take us, as we were just talking about, but let's go for it. Liberalism, what is liberalism? There's a lot of debate about what it means, what it is, what it entails, what it doesn't. But let's start there, and then we can see how things unfold.
Well, first of all, Tom, thank you. It's great to be here. Great to pick up a conversation that's been ongoing behind the scenes. I've really enjoyed becoming a little bit involved with ISI and your students and the remarkable group of people that are around you. You could have started with an easy question, but I guess there aren't any. All of these questions are going to be contested. For me, I think the principal question is how comprehensive in scope you take liberalism to be. I think for all sorts of reasons, not the least of which is the sort of guild silos of the American Academy, we tend to sever liberalism as a political theory from its broader roots in a vision of nature, and even arguably ultimately in metaphysics and theology, though oftentimes a lot of that remains quite implicit. And if you wanted to describe it simply, I mean, there are different kinds of liberalism. Rawlsian proceduralism, for example, is very different than what Russell Kirk proposed in the Principles of American Conservatism, or the Principles of Conservatism. But if you want to take those principles as a fair statement of liberalism conceived in political terms simply, I'm pretty fine with that. The idea of the primacy of the individual, the relationship between freedom and property, a suspicion of state power and the perfectibility of human nature. I can't rattle all 10 of them off the top of my head instantaneously. I don't fundamentally, and very importantly for Kirk at least, a principle of conservation, right? A deference as far as possible to precedent, to custom, to traditional forms that then has to be balanced against change, variety, innovation, and so forth. Considered strictly in political terms as a sort of place to begin, I'm fine with that. The question is, I think, whether or not that suffices to. I incline more towards the Richard Weaver type metaphysical dream. And this is because it seems to me any political philosophy, liberal or not, presupposes either explicitly or tacitly much more fundamental assumptions about the nature of nature itself. And interestingly enough, I think the architects of modern political theory, which became predominantly liberal, at least in the English-speaking world, most of them were simultaneously natural philosophers of some kind and political thinkers. I mean, if you think of Hobbes, even Locke to a certain extent, Thomas Jefferson, these are people who are heavily invested in, and in some cases drew their conception of politics almost with kind of Euclidean precision from a prior conception of nature. And in that case, it seems to me that one of contemporary liberalism's principal points of self-understanding, which I think is more or less discredited almost everywhere now, namely that it's, and this is kind of perhaps the hangover from Rawls, that it's neutral. Procedurally, it's simply a set of procedures that's neutral about the ultimate nature of things. I don't think that can be in principle theoretically true, or that it was historically true, which means that the possibilities for a post-liberalism, or for overcoming liberalism, or perfecting liberalism, what have you, seems to me to be the need to adjudicate those questions is partly at that deeper level.
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show. So then we're talking about a completely, not a new metaphysic per se, maybe it's, and again, I think there's a question of like, is post-liberalism return, or is it some new horizon, but a different understanding of metaphysics, of nature, of God, of the nature of science. Where does that put us then? Are we? Well,
it raises questions, first of all, about the inner coherence of liberalism itself, and if it's not internally coherent, that might help explain why. People are now talking about a post-liberalism, although that can mean whatever that turns out to mean. I think it can mean a variety of different things. For example, I mean, a principle of conservation is pretty difficult, and has proven, I think, historically, pretty difficult to sustain when you are committed fundamentally to a concept of freedom that is itself inherently revolutionary, a freedom that chafes against every kind of limit. And when your underlying metaphysic, if you want to put it that way, your underlying conception of nature and your underlying approach to nature prizes scientific truth and the perpetual advance of scientific progress, perpetual advance of the progress of the scientific conquest of nature, on the other hand. You end up, it seems to me, with kind of a two-pronged war against given realities and traditional forms that has played itself out and continues to play itself out in history. I think actually, one of the first people that I'm aware of, at least, to have made the explicit connection, and I know this is controversial in conservative circles because he's generally regarded as a bad guy, but to have made the explicit connection between the founding principles of liberalism and scientific or technological order was John Dewey, right? Who regarded Francis Bacon as at least an important figure for the founding of modern thought, as Locke or the more explicitly political thinkers. I mean, you could argue that when you get to Bacon's New Atlantis, that he's a political thinker as well. And I don't think it's accidental. If it's true that, maybe I could put this succinctly in the form of a kind of thesis, if it's true that liberalism as a political form is the political expression of the underlying judgments about nature and knowledge and truth that one finds in Francis Bacon and his scientific utopia, then it wouldn't be accidental that technological progress seems to have become our national collective raison d'etre. I mean, if there's a common project that we're all embarked upon in some form or fashion, it seems to be, and of course this is also bound up with economics, but it seems to be that. Maybe that's not simply the accidental byproduct of individual atoms of freedom pursuing their projects and being reconciled by a kind of invisible hand, but maybe it's the logical outworking of something deeper in liberal order itself.
That makes sense in the sense that, like, I think the story kind of goes as you have classical philosophy, the Greeks and the Romans, and they're advancing civilization in terms of sort of like material, technological pace. And then there's the Dark Ages, and then you have Bacon and the scientific revolution, and then everything like really takes off, and it accelerates and accelerates gradually. And so then I guess maybe we have to move more and talk and examine what Bacon's revolution really is. And can you help us? Because I think you've written that like it's not Hobbes and Locke per se, but it's more like Bacon is the sort of crowning, not the crowning achievement, but the real kickoff to the creation of the modern world. The Novus Ordo Seclorum is a Baconian, this sort of technological and economic uh, project that's become the sort of political outworking that we're just talking about.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, the relationship between those three thinkers is endlessly fascinating. I mean, Hobbes was Bacon's secretary, and there's a really interesting uh, dispute over the nature of science and the role of experimentalism. Hobbes wasn't entirely Baconian in this regard. That's uh, detailed in a classic book from the '80s, uh, Chapin and Schaeffer's Leviathan and the Air Pump. It's fascinating. Locke, it seems to me, his entire epistemology, as it were, um, which I take in kind of subtle ways that we need not get into, to be a complement to his political theory, effectively functions to make the world safe for Baconianism, right? And what all of this amounts to, just as modern politics in some ways is premised upon a kind of overthrow of the ancien regime in the political sphere. In the sphere of natural philosophy, this is all predicated on the overthrow of Aristotle, and an Aristotelian conception of nature with its given forms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And basically, what Bacon proposes is not simply a new method for achieving the same end or goal as uh, uh, Aristotelian sciences had done, but rather a new goal for knowledge itself, and a new method for pursuing it, and that goal being essentially to be able to assume control over the sort of secret inner workings of nature, which we do by taking it apart, experimenting with it, and putting it back together. And in that conception of things, really the truth of our knowledge is measured. I mean, hence the sort of famous Baconian phrase that, equating knowledge and power. The truth of our knowledge is measured by what we can do, by our power in realizing heretofore unrealized possibilities. So, one of the something that's become kind of a slogan for me that I've sort of repeated in a number of my writings to sort of encapsulate this is that you can only discover the limits of possibility by perpetually transgressing them. Well, our most authoritative form, by realizing what was heretofore regarded as impossible, by advancing one's level of control, right? It turns out, and this is there in Bacon, though sometimes it's more implicit, and Dewey makes it explicit. It turns out that is a social enterprise carried out across time, and requiring special forms of social organization and cooperation in order to achieve it. And so once you're committed to that vision of reality and that project and that conception of knowledge, something like Bacon's New Atlantis kind of begins to build itself. And I think that's arguably what we have become, arguably what we're in a sense destined to become. And so, therefore, just as freedom as a kind of infinite possibility is hostile to limits of various kinds, be they the limits of convention, the limits of my given nature, the limits that might be imposed in this view from outside by religion that's not itself freely and voluntarily chosen. So in the natural sphere, this conception of knowledge and its goal are hostile to the sort of given limitations of the natural order, which we're perpetually trying to overcome. You put those things together, and it creates a really interesting political and social kind of organism, which I think is what we are. I don't know if that is at all responsive to your question, or if it made any sense. But I can try again. If not.
I think it makes sense because if you have a project of the Baconian, is it is this an epistemology? Is this a like we have a way of doing knowledge that counts and it only counts this one way in the service of a goal or of a I guess maybe I don't fully understand yet, but
Well, it's not just. I mean, if you think about, let's just take a basic, the idea of a basic scientific experiment, right? How do you know when it's true? True
when
may not even be the exact kind when it works, right?
hmm
When I've succeeded in producing the result that I set out um, to produce, and when that result allows me then to move on and produce further results in kind of a chain. And it's interesting, it's sort of built into the nature of our knowledge that we don't ever know fully what results this given achievement might be well suited for. So we're continually surprised. We discover forms of knowledge and forms of power before we understand what they're for. I think we're replete with examples of that kind. I wrote an article recently where I used Twitter as an example for this. I mean, my understanding was Jack Dorsey and those guys set out to create a group messaging platform. They didn't necessarily set out to create a platform by which they would themselves control the entire spigot of public information. You have to discover what this power is actually good for after you have it, and there's always an element of surprise there. I'm veering far off now from your question, which was bring me back to it.
well, I think I understood what you were saying, which is that we have this new mode of exploring and transgressing limits. This is an epistemology, this is a metaphysic, and this is a political goal. I think
It's
you can
also
see that.
enthralling and amazing, by the way. Right? We should not leave that out, and that it has worked in astonishing ways that no one could have dreamed of, though Bacon himself came quite close. Anyway, carry on. I'm sorry.
Right, right. Like, yeah, all of the scientific and technological. I mean, like, this would not be possible. This podcast. That's sort of the cheap and easy example. Is we'd have to probably won't even know who you are. But anyways, um, it, we're transgressing limits. You can see that in the philosophy of Locke. We're going to limit the power of the state or the government and give people liberty. So that's the imposing, or that's moving beyond the limits that a society would impose based on an individual. And then you have someone like maybe John Stuart Mill, who wants to erode the limits imposed by the law of custom or social mores. And then now with things like transhumanism, modern feminism, transgenderism, to transgress the limits of the body and of basic conceptions of nature, logic, and the like. So I see that. Now I'm trying to figure out what the next question is, like where we move forward. Or this, could you tie maybe that how I sort of see that thread, but could you tie more how it ties into liberalism?
Yeah, well, let's go back to your original question because we began by trying to define our terms, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I was suggesting that a narrowly political conception of liberalism as a form of governance or as a philosophy of governance or as a set of principles is too narrow. That both as a historical matter and in principle as a matter of theory, just like any other political understanding, this one is the political embodiment of a much larger conception of reality, a much larger horizon of meaning. And I've been trying to describe that through this brief foray into Baconianism and the corresponding vision of nature. If that's true, then it seems to me that the question of post-liberalism, whether there can be such a thing, what we mean by post, hinges in part on whether we can get off that train or arrest control of it. One of the interesting elements of, and this is one of the things that I find so fascinating about the Trump moment, actually, and the kind of throwback to earlier great man of history kind of conception of things is it seems to me that there's an attempt here, whether it's fully self-conscious or very well developed may be another question, but an attempt here to arrest the train a little bit and direct it, because one of the interesting things I think about the dynamism that is set in motion by both a conception of freedom and a conception of nature, knowledge, and truth that are inherently revolutionary, is that it takes on a kind of life of its own, and it's very difficult to govern. We've seen this empirically in things in recent years, that some of the things that govern us most deeply and oppress us most, in a way that's most keenly felt, are not strictly political or governmental at all. And it's never quite clear who's in charge of them. But if there's a revolutionary dynamic built into our very way of being in modern political liberal order, then even if we want to conserve prior forms, even if we want to defer to custom, even if we want a principle of conservation, it's not clear how possible, it's not clear that we can have what we want, or whether the momentum of this thing carries along on its, I'm mixing my metaphors now, on its own, at the crest of its own wave, or something. And what's really interesting then is when, you mentioned transhumanism and the whole trans movement. What's really interesting, and I think there are other biomedical examples of this, and also examples in the sphere of communication. What's really interesting is when these two strands really do fuse and converge, right? When the political and the scientific, technological, when their revolutionary impulses either merge or feed each other in a way that makes adhering to precedent more and more difficult. For example, there was a strange echo just then. I don't know if you got it. Maybe it's just on my end. For example, once you have developed the technological capacity, you think, to convert or transform men and women into one another, just to give an obvious and quite pertinent example. That's knowledge that by its very nature sort of compels its use. It's knowledge that it's meant to do something. You're meant to do something with. It's not clear to me how one can then fully constrain that.
I want to pick up on the sort of metaphor, which maybe got mixed a little bit in there,
Yeah,
but the cresting wave and the train. So I guess there are a few options and a few different ways of looking at it. Is like we could try and wrest control of the train, or we could try and jump off of it, or we could try and blow up the train. Like I don't know if you've seen the movie Snowpiercer, but it's a post-apocalyptic. Everyone's on a train. There's a sort of class hierarchy. On the train. So like the people who are like most important and like upper classes are at the head of the train, and the people in the back are like the landless rabble. It is neo-feudal.
It's like the Titanic, only horizontal rather than vertical.
Yeah, like all of humanity is surviving on this train, and part of the movie is like they try and blow up the train. The people at the bottom try and get ahead to the top, and then there's a whole other sort of side plot of like we're gonna blow up the train and like leave it. We don't actually need it after all, but that's a different sort of thing. But what would it mean like to get off the train? Do we all have to get off the train collectively? Right? Like, are you off of the train? Or are you still stuck on the train, even though you're sort of like yearning to break free of it because you don't share the metaphysic of Bacon and this sort of project? And then, is it a few people trying to maybe wrest control of it? I'm sticking to this metaphor pretty strongly here.
Yeah.
But is it a few? Like, is it Trump and his team that can kind of wrest control of the thing, or is it the new polity crowd is going to wrest control of the train and refunction it or bring it to a break? Is this maybe like an individual thing where you're gonna have a pocket of critics who think the thing is coming to an end, or is it eventually it's gonna have to peter out, and then we'll have to kind of like a phoenix rising to the ashes, another metaphor, going to recreate ourselves or rediscover something that had gone awry.
Yeah, well, part of my criticism of various iterations of the post-liberal project, I suppose, um, though I tend to be quite sympathetic, actually, with a number of their sort of practical policy uh, objectives and goals. But is that they underestimate the length of the train. And part of my, at the beginning of this conversation, my original remarks was to try and give a deeper and broader sense of the size and scope of the problem. And we're really talking about an entire vision of reality that we're enmeshed in and that we have set into effect. To such a degree, it seems to me that I tend to regard it as, and I tend to regard the technological form of living really as a kind of regime of necessity, right? That might is beyond our power ultimately simply to opt out of, or to overthrow. We're enmeshed in not only this vision of things that makes the recovery of a kind of second naivete very difficult intellectually, but we're all deeply practically dependent. And in many instances, I mean, I'm continually rebuffed by the example of modern medicine, right? This is the place that people go to immediately the moment one begins to raise critical questions about technology. What are you in favor of leeching? No, I would prefer good drugs and highly refined surgeries. I mean, these are real advances. We're deeply enmeshed at this, and so to me, the question is not a question of wresting control. I mean, I know I used this language before, but I think I let the train metaphor run away with me a bit. It's not simply a matter of wresting control of this thing or overthrowing it or replacing what is now a kind of second nature for us. To me, the first task is always, and the task upon which ultimately freedom from a realm of necessity that's otherwise inescapable depends upon is kind of a contemplative one. It's understanding, it's seeing clearly, or as clearly as is possible for us, as fish within this fishbowl, seeing as clearly as possible the nature of the powers that govern us, the nature of what we've lost sight of, and trying in ways that I mean, there's an individual dimension to this, obviously, but also a social and collective one. Trying as far as possible to live in light of that understanding, even though it's obvious we're going to run up against all kinds of friction all the time. And I do think there are things about the present political moment that have been that conform to this somewhat. I mean, it has been revelatory. It has revealed a great deal, I think, about the nature of the spell we've been living under, and the institutional embodiment of that in our culture. So that may be another way of saying that there still are practical things that can be done and should be done, and that we should strive to do in the political sphere, to create, or to make possible again something more humane than what we were barreling toward in this sort of post-human, post-liberal, post-political future. And I have some hope for some of that, but I don't want to mistake those successes with an overcoming of this entire metaphysical dream that's really deep and that takes a much more concerted labor of thought, I think.
Yeah, the I'm very much struggling to have to continue the conversation because I don't know exactly where to point us to next.
I'm sorry. I feel like
It's not your
Kamala
fault.
Harris.
This is good because you're stretching my sense of imagination, what the concepts are. Um, I guess there's what. So what I hear you saying, I guess, is there is a level of the idea of post-liberalism. It's completely impractical in the sense of we're not going to we're not going to take over the train, nor can we blow it up. We are in this thing, and yet there are some things that we can do, namely a sort of contemplative understanding, being maybe the biggest thing, both individually and in terms of maybe what we'd call a public philosophy or a public and social understanding. Then to talk about this sort of everyone cribs you like, hey, you want us to go back to the dark ages of medicine. Um, what is this? I guess what's assumed in that sort of critique? What's the assumption? I guess what I see is if it's impractical, or if what you're saying has no practical relevance, or we're not going to go back to the dark ages of medicine. No one wants to do that. I don't think anyone's willing to do that, and for good reason. Then the objection is untrue or meaningless. Is it? Am I onto something there?
That's a great question. And I think there are probably different facets to the answer. And before I get to it, though, let me back up. I mean, I do forgive me if this discussion is scrambling your categories. That may not be your fault. I'm having a kind of Kamala Harris type experience where if I'm just speaking in word salads that aren't intelligible, I apologize for that. No, okay. Now back to your question. I think I've asked myself variations of that question. What it is that people find so threatening about an attempt to sort of deeply critique the nature of the political and technological order that we live in, kind of down to its bones or its roots. And I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but part of it may be I think that people are afraid of discovering that, in fact, the control that we've imagined that we have, we don't. It seems fatalistic. I don't think it is, but that's because I have a kind of I don't think hope and optimism are the same thing, and that there are metaphysical and for that matter religious reasons for that. I think that's part of it. I think it also reflects the fact it also reflects the kind of systematic denigration of thought in modern and particularly American society. I mean, I loved. I forget, in fact, where I imbibed this, but the idea that pragmatism is not just a school of philosophy that appeared at the end of the 19th and the early part of the 20th century on American soil, but it is something like the American spirit having become philosophically conscious of itself. We are deeply and inherently pragmatic, and therefore we don't know what to do with quote unquote theoretical truth that doesn't have an immediate practical application. We don't know what to do with knowledge that might be true, but for all conventional purposes, useless. We don't really see a value in that because we've made utility the measure of the knowledge, the measure of the truth of our knowledge and of its value. Right. So unless I get this question all the time from my students. Well, if what you're saying is correct, what do we do? Well, hold on. You're beginning to understand. You are doing something. Let's do more of that, and then perhaps what further practical options are available to us will become clearer. that the act first, think later approach to things, I don't think is necessarily a great philosophy of life. I suspect that kind of pushback or that kind of resistance probably is an amalgam of all of those things. And what I would want to suggest, and it's really, it's not idiosyncratic. It's the idea is as old as Plato. That that a truth that is good for what it is rather than what it does, at least in the first instance, is actually an indispensable ingredient of being free. And it's the way that one, in a certain sense, transcends a realm of necessity that you can't otherwise escape. And now, having said all of that, back in your original characterization that led up to this question, this is not to deny. I mean, I get accused of being a kind of quietist or a hobbit. I mean, I forget all of the various sort of insults that this is not to say, right, that this is not to eschew practical politics or to say that nothing can be done through politics to better our lives, to make them more humane, to provide some relief, as it were, from these necessities, or to rechannel them. And one of the things that's both refreshing, astonishing, and a little bit frightening about the present moment is it's revealing what can still be done through the exercise of political power and through political will. So I don't want to denigrate or minimize that. I just don't want to remain. It's not enough. I don't want to be content with it.
Okay, that makes some sense, because like the danger for post-liberalism then is that it replicates this sort of let's say like theory praxis confusion,
Right.
and says we're going to we just have a better theory, or rather we'll work within the existing horizons of what practice is, and then the theory will fit into that. I guess so. Then this is really interesting.
If I maybe even more, more crudely summarize this, because you hear this kind of thing all the time now, right? We're in power now. A new age of truth has dawned, etc. Right? The idea that the fundamental problem inherent in liberal order can be resolved by the right guys being in power. The right guys being in power are undoubtedly better than the wrong guys being in power. But if this is as comprehensive in scope as what we're suggesting, then it's a bit more challenging than that. I'm sorry I interrupted you, but
no, what you just said it's reminiscent of some of the conversations I've had on this podcast with Andrew Willard Jones, who I know is a sort of colleague at you both write with New Polity amongst other places, and so that makes sense.
Brilliant, by the way.
Some of amazing conversations I think I've been able to have with him. But yeah, I think that's hopefully something that's familiar to the listeners as well if you've listened to those. All right, so then I have something. There's, I guess, two sort of trains of thought that I think we could put together, which is we started with every political philosophy, including some sort of practical political program, is downstream of I don't really like the word worldview. I was saying that yesterday. That I think it's almost like the word values. It's kind of like we just have them, and like you have your values and I have mine. But for lack of a better word, it's a worldview. It's a comprehensive conception of reality. Is a metaphysics, an epistemology, a philosophical anthropology, what a human being is. All of these things inform a political philosophy, and then with some level of determination by, through prudence and stuff, that a political program or a regime. Then we have within our current situation, the impracticability of a post-liberalism simply within our current state of things. But there's still some practical stuff that we can do. I guess the question is then, if there's simply trying to, again, use the train metaphor, wrest control of the train is maybe like a Scylla. So we're going to sort of play the same game of like subordinating truth to power, but we're going to do it, and so it'll be great. And the sort of Charybdis of maybe like an ideological closed system of like axiomatic theory to praxis without prudence. Um, could you sort of situate like what's the mean between the two extremes of, well, we'll just do pragmatism, like, but our version, and the we'll reimpose Thomism. Uh, Not saying that that's what you want to do, obviously, but that's one thing perhaps on offer amongst the sort of post-liberal movement is we'll do Thomism, and here's Thomas's system, and we'll reimpose it, and we'll use whatever means. Does that question hopefully make sense, or it puts a couple things together, I think?
Yeah. Let me address a couple of the premises, or at least the sort of preamble to the question itself, just to clarify a couple of points.
Sure.
Because this is another thing that I get challenged upon when I talk about political order as the manifestation or the expression or the presupposing a metaphysical vision. I don't necessarily mean, because people, assuming this is what I mean, criticize this all the time. I don't necessarily mean beginning with some kind of explicit metaphysical system and then sort of deducing the proper political structure from it. Now, it happens that some of the early, the architects of early modern political theory did precisely that. They begin with sort of highly abstract theoretical states of nature, in Hobbes's case, a sort of mechanistic material one, and begin to sort of deduce almost in a kind of, as I said earlier, Euclidean way. All I really mean is that the one's own metaphysics are oftentimes, what we really believe. Charles McGee had the great line that he said this both of modern people generally and modern Christians specifically, that we don't believe what we believe. In other words, the deepest premises and implications of our thought are often concealed from us. And they're concealed from us because it doesn't operate in that way, but because it's entailed in the way we're imagining political order. This is what reality would have to be if political order is really like this, or if this is the ideal political order. So when I talk about the metaphysical dimension of political order, I'm talking something more like that than the kind of Euclidean thing. The other point that I wanted to address in that is you said something about the impracticability, my critique of the impracticability of post-liberalism. I think post-liberalism is a quite confused term, and it's not clear to me immediately what it is and what falls under it and what qualifies. And I've tried to sort of sift through some of that a little bit and bring some clarity to it and show that some of what goes by the name of post-liberalism is just a downstream iteration of liberalism, and therefore not clear about its own nature. On the other hand, if we were, if by post-liberalism we mean the revelation of liberalism's internal contradictions and something like their collapse, or something like their manifestation in a political form that is not principally about freedom, for example, and it's quite authoritarian, that means something else. I mean, so the term post-liberalism is almost equivocal. And I just want to have that on the table so as to not oversimplify this. Now, with respect to navigating between Scylla and Charybdis, that's a tricky question. And I think, there are things that have to be done, things that obviously can be done. Like, for example, restoring sanity to how we speak in public documents, eliminating certain kinds of programs that are the vehicles of a pernicious anti-human ideology, that don't require a deep theoretical reflection in order to see that they're desirable and that we ought to do them. And thankfully, some of that appears to be taking place. as far as trying to steer through this through the deep waters of this. I've written a bit lately. I've had a couple of occasions, provoked in part by things that are going on in the whole sphere of trans medicine on the one hand, or the Alabama Supreme Court decision on the status of IVF embryos created by IVF on the other hand. An opportunity to think back a little bit on the significance, really the historically unique significance, I think, of the Bioethics Commission that President Bush convened in the summer of 2001, just prior to 9/11, to tackle specifically the question of the use of embryonic stem cells, but which expanded into a much broader reflection on the role of biotechnology in 21st century American life. This was the commission chaired by Leon Cass and composed of a number of other luminaries. And I've had numerous occasions to revisit both their report on cloning and the use of stems, cloning as a means for extracting stem cells, but then also more generally their report on biotechnology as such. And I'm convinced that history, long after we're gone, if there's anybody left to really think about these things, is going to look back on that as kind of the high watermark of American public philosophy, and certainly the high watermark of American government documents, to be sure. And where am I going with this? The point is that here's an example of an attempt to sort of restore a kind of philosophical thoughtfulness to our public life, and to governmental deliberations. I mean, the assumption behind even the existence of such documents is that these are things that we can reason about, and that there are deeper implications here that pragmatism can't capture for us, that need to be thought through. Part of what I would like to see, I don't have a whole lot of hope for this from a Trump administration, but you never know. He's got some interesting people working for him. I'd like to see an attempt to restore that kind of public thought, and to deepen the public conversation or the public deliberation over the meaning of the times that we live in. I don't know if that's possible, because the very technologies through which we now conduct our public discourse have a superficializing effect on that discourse. But there are exceptions to that too. I'm really kind of fascinated by and late to come to the party and late to see the significance of things like this, and the way in which, no offense to you, but much larger podcasts, for example, have kind of broken the power of the reality machine a little bit, and opened up avenues for seeing and thinking. We need more of that, and we need more of that actually to be as official policy, I think. To restore. I mean, Americans aren't typically a very philosophical people. A lot of what I'm talking about is really fundamentally about reclaiming a place for non-pragmatic philosophical thinking in our conception of reason, and in our common life, and in our political deliberations. The social sciences do not have all the answers, nor does medicine.
Right. And the academy is not going to be enough to, like the liberal arts academy won't be enough. It has to move beyond the ivory tower, I think is what you're pointing to. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the Trump, this sort of the new golden age, and like the smashing of the machine, Or I don't know exactly what to make of it either because it's happening very fast. But I mean, people are claiming like, oh, liberal technocratic governance is over, and we're 25 days in maybe to the presidency. Um, and they're thinking, people are like, the implications of what we're seeing have yet to be felt, and we've only just gotten started. So it's like, I mean, maybe I'll have to have you back in 10 years and be like, what was it? What was this really like? But um, has this given you what we've seen so far in the last couple of weeks given you for maybe not a reconsideration, but an evaluation of what is possible and
Yeah.
what it might mean?
Technocratic governance is over as we automate all governmental systems through AI. Hold those two things. I don't know. I'm a bit shocked and awed at the moment, and some of my categories, I think, for thinking about current events are being scrambled by something I don't think anyone quite anticipated. Such a vigorous and comprehensive exercise of executive power. I don't know what it means ultimately constitutionally. I don't know whether the attempt to substantially dismantle the administrative state will succeed. I don't know what the casualties of that or the ultimate goods of that might be. I don't think anybody does at this point. What I find really, really interesting, and there's something exhilarating about it. There are many of these things that I think many of us who have sort of felt the oppressive weight of the system that we've been living under are relieved to see take place. There are other aspects of it that people disagree on or that are a little bit more unsettling. I for one, just personally, am not as much of a hawk on the immigration question as the administration seems to be, but that's neither here nor there. I mean, one of the things that I think is really interesting about it, I mean, suddenly you're seeing all of these pieces pop up about the sort of return of the great man of history theory in the aftermath of Fukuyama's end of history and all the rest of it. And it is a really interesting contrast, it seems to me. I mean, in a way, it's a contrast that can even be sort of summed up in the election itself. I mean, one of the reasons why it seems to me Joe Biden was so replaceable, right? And could be interchanged with, substitute another candidate, could have been somebody besides Kamala, whomever, is that what Joe Biden nominally presided over, just how nominally, we're learning, given the state of his health. But what Joe Biden nominally presided over was a system, a machine of sorts whose operations were largely invisible, right? And a system, it turns out, that has been governing us in ways that haven't always even been visible to us, putting its finger on the scales in this direction or creating this kind of incentive or disincentive in that direction. It's really quite remarkable. I mean, and and it really became as visible as it has ever been, I think, from the pandemic on through the election, right? It became hard not to see the gears of this machine in their operation. Whereas when you were voting for Trump, you're voting for a man, right? In fact, perhaps too self-referentially so. And it's an extraordinary contrast. And the man won, right? So now what? In some ways, it's now the man versus the machine. And I don't know that, and there seems to be some sense amongst the people that he has gathered around him that's the case. They know sort of where the nodal points are that they think need to be dismantled. where the gears join together or what have you. It's a fascinating thing to watch. I don't know what it means. Um, at that level, the very fact that the means for dismantling the machine, though, look like they're going to be uh, an even further refinement of the fact that the tech bros have been brought in to achieve this, and that the way they're going to do this is to streamline and make efficient certain systems in the government, perhaps quasi automate them through AI, suggests at the very least that we haven't seen the end of technocracy, and there's going to be pushback.
There's no pushback. We're having a fire drill in our office. So can I just leave the thing recording and come back in hopefully 5 minutes when it's all done?
Sure.
Sorry about that. It's just a fire drill.
Okay.
There's no fire. We were told we were going to have this at some point, and we'll just cut it out. It's gone. All right.
Okay.
Well, I have to go anyways because I know I have to go down to the flagpole. But I'll be back in a few.
Yeah, I'll be here.
I appreciate that. Sorry.
Sure.
Actually, that was a false alarm. That was I guess a drill to the drill. I don't know.
Uh-huh.
I don't think we'll see if it goes off again. I'll let you know. But and we'll edit this part out. But let's see. So we were talking about we're not sure what it means. All right. Here's based on what you were talking is one of the things that's interesting to me is that Trump is, even though he's dismantling a machine, which is predicated on or fits within a metaphysic of sort of the technological project, the things that we were talking about earlier. He's also doing that from the vantage point of a person who's like an ultimate pragmatist.
Yeah.
He's not a philosopher. Even J.D. Vance, who I think is probably more philosophically inclined or has a more complete metaphysical, practical. Like he's not. Vance is not a philosopher king, but he's more of a philosopher king type than I think President Trump is. Like Trump is the ultimate pragmatist because he's a businessman. He thinks in terms of
Yeah.
winning and deals.
Connections.
Yeah, commerce. Say what you will about various specifics and how that bears out, but I think that what that means, I find it fascinating that the pragmatist is coming in to destroy a system that sort of enables and perpetuates the sort of pragmatic functions of endless progress, including the outsourcing of a lot of the governance to either foundations. Obama was famous for this, was using foundations and the power of big money to push his causes through culture, education, finance. And then the sort of subtle behind the scenes during the Biden administration of information technology, banking, and the like to push things further in the way that he wants to, and also crack down on dissent. But what that leaves, I mean, if you have a thought based on that, what I just said, go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like I've discovered this. Listening, weaving my way back around to this. I've discovered in recent days, I think, that I probably should have spent more time over the last 6, 7, 8, even 10 years, familiarizing myself with various kinds of online alt-right thinkers that I have not taken very seriously. Probably because, and this is partly a generational thing. I mean, Hans Jonas has this great observation that I've gone back to again and again, that you're living in revolutionary times when you find yourself becoming obsolete within your own lifetime. And there's such a generational divide, I think, between my generation and yours, frankly. between those who have, lived part of their life offline, and those who grew up inside of the matrix of the internet. And when you're looking at this from my generational point of view, I think sometimes it's easy to be late to taking certain things seriously. And I now realize that I should have been taking people like Curtis Yarvin, who I still haven't really read, but I've read a bit about, more seriously. Because if one's looking for a sort of logic or blueprint for the early days of the Trump administration, there have been some suggestions, at least, that at least part of it's being, coming from that quarter. And what I have read or read about in sort of encountering these people is that it strikes me that they're much better diagnostically than prescriptively. I mean, there are some real insights there into the nature of the powers that rule us. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about that, and that is quite pertinent to the liberalism, post-liberalism debate. I mean, there's a really interesting question about the extent to which we actually live under anything like the pieties that liberalism imagines for itself. Or whether that's a kind of gloss or veneer over a form of life and a de facto system of government that bears no resemblance to those pieties, even though it may be rooted in the same deep metaphysical assumptions about progress and nature and science and the administration of all of that. And I suspect something probably similar is true of the Trump administration, that they've identified and are bringing to light in ways that are, apocalyptic in the etymological sense. I mean, it's a real revelation of the very kinds of structures that you just enumerated that have been somewhat concealed from us. And they're quite clearly attempting to dismantle as many of those as possible, as rapidly as possible. That's one thing. Building back is another. And I'm not convinced I suspect there'll be a lot of hardship that accompanies this as it unfolds over time. We're already living in a world where basic things seem no longer to work reliably. The horrible plane crash, for example, that just happened in D.C. a couple of weeks ago. Deeply disturbing. I mean, anybody who flies in and out of D.C. has taken that line of can put themselves in that position immediately to be, within seconds of a safe touchdown on the ground, and then to have something like that happens. And that, Helen Andrews wrote a piece maybe a year ago. I remember being struck by something about we don't realize how Soviet we actually are. Do you recall the piece, or did you see it?
I read that piece.
Yeah, and one of the things she points out is just the way that basic societal functions have and are breaking down. Everything from things like airline safety to the social consensus that undergirds retail shopping. Where I live, if I go down the street to the CVS and want some toothpaste, I have to get a warden to unlock it and release it. I mean, that's a sign of something deeply disturbing. It's not clear to me that we have a project, or that Trump has a project for restoring that kind of consensus and making it effective. Some things, eliminating inefficiencies or returning competence to a criterion for hiring, are hopeful things. I would hope that the first criterion for being an air traffic controller is being a really good air traffic controller. Those kinds of things no doubt will help. But the fraying of our social consensus, such as it is pretty severe. And I'm not sure that some of the dismantling of some of these things won't have at least the short-term effect of making that fraying worse and making some of those functions um, uh, break down more. So I don't know where this is going to go. I think diagnostically and destructively, they're onto something. But what we put in place of this labyrinthine structure is not as clear.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I was reading yesterday, I think it was Matt Continetti, and in the Free Press had an article talking about Angelo Codevilla, who maybe you read his articles back in like 2010, and like I think Rush Limbaugh like read it on his show back in the day, and then became a bit more of a book, but it's called The Ruling Class. And Continetti credits Codevilla with being like most of the terminology and some of the basic impulses of this administration, including some of the personnel hires, is a function of Angelo Codevilla's thought. And one of the points he makes at the end of that book is like, it speaks to the point you were just raising at the end there, which is like, are we actually capable of a return to self-government in place of the sort of system of managed society and honestly managed decline that we've been in? Because that takes a lot of work and virtues and insights that we have allowed to fray. That's his. He doesn't say it's definitively true, but he says this appears to be what's the case. So it remains to be seen, almost in the sort of same way that Hamilton and Madison and the Federalists say it remains to be seen whether we can do this. Is this experiment even possible? Do we have the requisite virtue to have self-government? And we haven't had that for a while, I think, is what we're learning more and more. And now, yeah, what happens next is the operative question.
Yeah, and there's probably more than one sense to that question about capability, right? I mean, there's the Madisonian sense. You can probably quote to me. I'll butcher it. The famous line about a constitution for a virtuous people. You know the one.
Yeah, John Adams, our
Is it
Constitution
Adams?
is
Okay,
made for a moral and virtuous people. It is inadequate to the form for any other, or something like that. I think
yeah,
it's
I mean, I knew that would be part of your catechism, so I would hand that over to you. There's that aspect of it, right? Whether or not um, uh, we possess those things. It's an interesting question to ask why we might not. Um, and one of the reasons, I mean, apart from all sorts of various kinds of sort of cultural decadence and debauchery, um, one of the reasons why we might not, in fact, might have something to do with, uh, in a very subtle way, with the role of technology in our lives, right? The ways in which, and this is reflected, for example, in um, the medicalization of all human phenomena, including what were once moral phenomena, right? And the idea that there might be a clinical or technical substitute to a problem of the human spirit that once required the kind of formation and and capacity for governance that a proper education was supposed to help create in us. I mean, we really no longer even have a sense of what it would be to possess that kind of virtue. What we don't have, of what that kind of virtue is, because we've farmed out um, human excellences, both moral and theoretical, right, or intellectual, to either various agencies or to this machine and network that we're talking through. I mean, the human intellectual capacities, it seems to me, our capacity for even basic things like memory, like remembering, or for attending, right? I mean, if you think about the kind of discipline that is required, the kind of self-command that is required to sustain an act of attention, for example, from the beginning to the end of a book, and how few of us even possess that anymore, right? It's funny. I've used this example numerous times, but I could still tell you the phone number of the girl that I had a crush on in the third grade. But I can't tell you my son's cell phone number, right? Because once upon a time, I had to internalize those things and remember them for myself. Now, my phone does my memory, my remembering on my behalf, and that's a kind of an image, I think, for not only our intellectual capacities but also our moral ones, right? That we've farmed those out, as it were, to the experts and to the professionals. Another aspect of that question about our capability might have to do with something that we've already talked about, which is our capacity to resist our capacity to resist technological progress that runs on autopilot. In other words, whether we can we govern the internet, for example? Now, I don't mean that in the sense of policing disinformation or all of that, but in a more basic sense of whether we're principally directing it or it principally directing us. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question about and an ingredient in that broader question about the possibility of something really different, of a way of life that's really different than the one we've embarked on and that we're enmeshed in.
I think part of the discussion too, in the sort of debate, I guess, over who controls the Trump administration or who sort of establishes a new governing philosophy, if we're in power, we're going to destroy this machine. Who knows what that looks like, as we're kind of talking about, or what are the limits of that case. But then there's also the various factions of who's vying for control. So kind of like the tech bros versus, part of that I think is like the return to self-government, classically understood, not maybe even classical, but like understood at the founding. Like we're going to return to the founding. And I know this is something that you and I have talked about elsewhere. So maybe we can segue to this a little bit, is this idea that the administrative state, the state that we found ourselves in, that we're now trying to destroy, is an aberration or a virus that has infected itself into American society and then set up shop and is now almost like a demon possessing America. And if we could just exorcise that demon, then we could go back to the Constitution and constitutional principles and the constitutional morality, the philosophy of public Republican society, and then things would be fine. And I know you're skeptical of that for a number of reasons. Yeah. That's something I'd like to explore. I mean, we're going on for a while, but we're here, so we might as well.
Sure.
What's the problem with the hijack thesis?
Yeah. Well, it's not simply false. It is quite clear that what John Dewey, as a kind of the intellectual architect for the sort of progressivism that Woodrow Wilson would make practical, what he calls Renaissance liberalism, does differ on a number, and in fact invert at a number of fundamental points that he is quite explicit about. The sort of first principles of classical 18th century Lockean liberalism. That's not simply false. But what I think, and I'll take Dewey here as my example because I know his argument pretty well, and I think he's actually right in this respect. That his point, part of his argument is that his Renaissance liberalism is both the logical and the historical outworking of deeply Baconian principles that also underlie classical liberalism. So while at a certain level, at a certain empirical level, I don't know whether this is principally a neoconservative or a paleoconservative argument that you just made. But that argument about a kind of 19th century corruption of classical liberalism by Hegel and German historicism, and transforming the Constitution and the political order from a kind of Newtonian model to a Darwinian evolutionary model. There's a certain truth to that. The point is that I would argue that that truth is built into our basic conception of freedom as the overcoming of limits, or as preserving a kind of sphere of possibility that then recreate those limits not as prior given realities, but as objects of choice, which we may or may not choose, and built into our predominantly scientific or technological approach to nature, which issue in the kind of social form, what Dewey called the organized assault on nature, that characterizes our life. And part of his point is, and our way of living, and has characterized it since the at least the middle of the 19th century. The Yeah, I lost my train of thought there for a minute. The point being that he argues that his Renaissance / progressive liberalism is, in a sense, the outworking of scientific progress itself and the kind of society that has helped create. And I think there's a lot, actually. I don't like it. I don't advocate it. I'm not a Deweyan in that sense. But diagnostically, I think he's fundamentally correct on some of these points, and it's true. And there's therefore an element of truth to the paleo-conservative critique of the progressive fall, if you will, from classical liberal principles. But the deeper truth is that progressivism eventually issues naturally from the same deep premises about nature that underlie the classical formulation. I mean, Locke largely envisioned a society built upon, morality and improving our conveniences, as it were, through a kind of Baconian science. It's also been, arguably as a historical matter, it being the commitment to the Baconian paradigm has been an indispensable ingredient in making this continent habitable and making it a nation in so short a period of time. I mean, one of the things that I find really interesting historically about Jefferson is not only his political theory, but the relationship between that and his steadfast commitment to the American Philosophical Society founded by Franklin, committed to the advance of useful knowledge, right? In a sense, Baconian science. These two things have been with us and interwoven with each other historically and theoretically from the very beginning. And therefore, the fall is not just a fall. It's also, I think, the logical outworking. And there's no room in that, ultimately, I think, for anything like a pre-modern conception of nature.
It's a transformation, if you will, of some of the terms. So it's kind of, this is like even Locke does this too in the, and I had a conversation on the podcast with Paul DeHart, and he kind of explained in a way that has helped me understand Locke better. Is like there's a Locke against Locke. There are sort of like two different strands that he said that DeHart says are contradictory within Locke. There's both the classical metaphysician following Aristotle, and then there's the more like Hobbesian voluntarist nominalist, and you see both of them and they contradict each other, and Locke never reconciles them. So that's maybe a separate question, but like I guess that when it comes to talking about Locke, that maybe confuses us because you can point out various things in him. But
yeah.
If you have a thought, but I don't even think that's the real question.
Yeah, I don't think this is the place to sort of adjudicate, to really get into the the guts of Locke, which I don't have immediately ready to hand. I'm not familiar with that particular line of argumentation. It doesn't sound right to me, but you know, I can't pronounce on it without a deeper. I have my own way of, I think, trying to bring the various aspects of Locke's program together. I do think there are some internal consistencies there, but I wouldn't characterize those as having being partially Aristotelian and partially evolved, unless what you mean is something like the appeal to the laws of nature. Locke's position relative to the natural law tradition that you find in someone like Riley, unless this maps on, unless what you just described maps onto that discourse, then maybe I can kind of see. That would be a pretty complicated thing to get into here. I would simply say that, as a principle, that once your understanding of nature has fundamentally changed in an anti-Aristotelian, Newtonian type direction, that what you mean by law and the laws of nature, even though you employ the same language and perhaps even some of the same moral substance, will be fundamentally transformed. And I think you can show that that's what happens in Locke.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak for Paul. And
Yeah.
he wrote a book last year, but and we talked about it, and so there was a sort of sense in which there's a something that follows the classical tradition on natural law, and then there's
Yeah.
something where Paul DeHart says, like Locke states in the essay on human understanding, that he is a nominalist and that there are only particulars, there are no universals. And so then that follows, following Hobbes, that like he is a metaphysical and moral voluntarist, that these things are the sort of the ultimate will of an all-powerful, omnipotent God. So he says that these things contradict, and so Locke's contradictory. But maybe that stems from assuming that nature, like that the laws of nature and the nature of moral obligation are actually Baconian and not Aristotelian. So that could be something else entirely. But anyways, this maybe gets us more afield than what we're trying to say. Or I guess, are we being naive if we assume, or maybe not even assume, but think that, when the founders talk about the laws of nature and nature's God, that they aren't talking about something classical or Greco-Roman, but modern and mechanistic, Newtonian. Um, Maybe it's another way of asking the question is, how do we deal with all of the evidence, maybe on both and all sides of the question about the founding, which might not even be the right question or vantage point or frame in the first place. How do we deal with and interpret, because it's not self-evident probably, that it points to just one train of thought that's sort of demonstrative and beyond question, we can move on. How do we deal with the questions, the bodies of evidence, the writings of various founders, ratification debates, public documents, that everyone is debating? And I think there's maybe like kind of two big schools that I think at least are very interesting. And this is probably like you and Patrick Deneen and DC Schindler, McIntyre, Michael Sandel to some extent, and others. And then there's the more what I call probably the Claremont School, the Jaffa students, the Robert Riley Natural Law School. And there's this sort of, I think, a debate over that historical period, the philosophy of that period, the philosophy in itself, not even for historical questions. I feel like I've just thrown a lot at you.
Well, there's not a simple answer to how to
Yeah.
sort of stand outside all of that and adjudicate it, right? I mean, you have to immerse yourself in the weeds and try and sort through it and come to some sort of a judgment. Um, and it's funny because I've found myself, in a certain sense, drawn into this argument. In some ways, it was never. I don't know how important it is, or I wouldn't think it's so important to impugn or to call into question um, the operative assumptions at work in the founding. If it weren't for this the group of people advancing the line of argumentation that you already alluded to, namely that if we could just return to those principles, we could rest there, all right, and everything would be okay. To me, that so what's interesting is that the argument itself over the founding is not a pure disinterested philosophical argument. It's a political argument about the present, and we ought to be clear about that to a certain extent. Or what's motivating this kind of a defense of the founding is present political concerns. I do think there is a deep and in principle philosophical and historical question to be explored there, and I don't have all the tools at my disposal to think that I've done an adequate or comprehensive job of that. And there are historians that I think are very important that I've drawn a lot on to help form my own picture of what the 18th century thought world was like. But I will say this, that I will say a couple of things. One, I've always been struck that many of those who continually appeal to the laws of nature and of nature's God to make this kind of argument about the founding seem largely uninterested in the content of those notions and what nature, law, and God meant, generally speaking, in an 18th century context. And I think it's important to try, and the way that those notions were undergoing or had undergone transformation because of the deeper metaphysical revolution that constitutes the modern world over against the ancient. If you're trying to connect, and this may help partially to account for the contradiction in the book you cited earlier, which I can't comment. I mean, it's not beyond me to comment on books I haven't read, but I won't in this case. I can't really comment on that. But this may be partially responsible for that contradiction. If you're trying to draw continuity, a sort of continuous line of natural law thinking from the Middle Ages to the 18th century, without taking into account the radical transformation that took place across various spheres of knowledge and our understanding of nature, law, and God, then you're involved in, it seems to me, something that is a priori anachronistic. So that would be part of my overall assessment of that. But short of telling you, here are, I think, really interesting people to read who might help create a picture that you can then make judgments on the basis of. I don't know how to tell you a priori to sort of adjudicate that controversy. I will just say for myself that what I've attempted to do is to situate that development in political thought within that broader revolutionary transformation that was taking place beneath the surface, of which people like Hobbes, Locke, Jefferson, etc., were clearly a part.
I don't know exactly where that leaves us, and I think that was something that we talked about too. Is like there's not necessarily answers to this stuff, but the raising of questions and recovering, real thought as opposed to, political sloganeering. Let's say.
Yeah, well, I think there are answers. I think there are better and worse answers, but they're not slogans. They're not easy. I mean, it takes a real and there are methodological questions about. I mean, you have to make philosophical judgments about what weight to give to certain kinds of documentary evidence, etc. And those themselves are subject to criticism. I mean, I have no doubt that a historian, a proper sort of strict historian, would find fault to the way that I tend to sort of prioritize the philosophical in this regard. I will put in a plug, I have to say, for a historian that has helped me a great deal, I think, to understand the thought world of the revolutionary and constitutional period, from someone who is perceptive and critical, but very sympathetic to it. I mean, not any kind of ideological anti-American, is the historian Gordon Wood. He's just fantastic. You've probably read him, but his Empire of Liberty, or the Idea of America, or the Radicalism of the American Revolution, have for me helped provide have both helped provide historical confirmation, but also deepened and illuminated and opened up philosophical judgments that I'd already made. So I've found his work extraordinarily helpful in this regard. And he treats a lot of the he's very good at treating both the sort of conceptual world of the 18th century and minute documentary evidence in the same way. And not to mention that he's a learned man and a wonderful writer and a pleasure to read.
Well, that's very helpful and a good plug. Maybe we'll close with even this question. There's the sort of, if America was good at the start, then what's happened, or what has happened, then the cause wasn't from the beginning, then we'll be okay. So I see the practical relevance to today. So, or the concerns of today tying back could be coloring for sure our reading of that past, but then also the sort of why we need to look back to see where we are now and where we could be. But how much do you think that this question or this debate over the founding, which at least coming from where I am, I think is actually an essential question. If I were dedicate a life to, this is a plausible thing to study deeply, not just for polemics, but I think the sort of historical, philosophical question that you raise is this would be worthwhile. This might be one of them. The problem of technology and of science might be another one. And there are a few things that might be central things. That's where I'm coming from. How important is this really, this sort of question over the American founding, or how relevant, and does that matter? Or should we be focusing on something else entirely?
I think it's important. I mean, I think it's very important. I mean, what we all hopefully are trying to get at here. I mean, what we want to understand is the nature of our own country, the nature of the order that we find ourselves in and ruled and governed by, and its relationship to the truth about who we are as human beings and the nature and order of things. I do think that an attempt to come to terms with the logic, the presuppositions, the implication, the thought world of the American founding is essential to that, because a founding is both a kind of historical first cause, but also a kind of final cause. I mean, it gives shape to what then profound shape to what subsequently unfolds in history. And in some sense, that's what we're arguing about, right? Everyone agrees that from the perspective of 20th century technocratic American life and the authoritarian turn that it's taken and the anti-human turn that it's taken, and this strange combination of great power and individual powerlessness, that something's gone profoundly wrong, right? So what we're trying to understand, what everybody seems to me to be trying to get at, is what went wrong. Why have we turned out like this? And there are always going to be sort of I don't want to suggest that there's a mechanically deterministic answer to that. That's not the way final causality works, right? It's not. There are all kinds of contingent historical decisions and events that might have gone otherwise. If Robert E. Lee's advanced scout party at Gettysburg hadn't gone off and gotten lost for 3 days, the entire course of American history might look different. I mean, it hinges on, the course of events hinges on very, very small contingent happenings, and yet there is obviously a deep relationship between the original form and what we've become. And what we're all trying to understand is that. And part of I didn't mean in my earlier comment to suggest that attempting to understand the founding as deeply as possible wasn't worthwhile. To the contrary, what I was trying to suggest is that I don't think actually some of our attempts to understand the founding are really about understanding the founding. I think they're about making present political arguments. I think, and my problem with that is that, in fact, it gives us permission to stop thinking prematurely, right? It gives us permission to stop short of a deep understanding, without which, we might not get the full picture, or as full a picture as we can have, of why things have turned out this way.
Josh Mitchell has called it, I think he's called it theoretical deep mining or historical deep mining. Is, let me kind of take this, we'll say, well, the founders thought this, therefore this is how our system works, and boom, no income tax, we have to get rid of it. And so it's sort of, it's not a complete picture. It's sort of, ad hoc. It's almost sophistry that, political people use, and that's different from a more academic, might be the wrong word, but academic attempt to more completely, thoughtfully understand what these things are. Because to me, it's an interesting question about education too. Is what do we teach rising generations about what our country is, how things? Because I don't know, if you teach basic constitutional theory to 7th and 8th graders, as I did for a semester, my last semester of college, I was aware at the time, and only more so now, that what I'm teaching them is more or less completely unrecognizable from, so it has the form, we still have the 3 branches of government, it doesn't work like that. And that also, I think, fosters a sort of disillusionment with people once they go, yeah, what I learned in high school about American history and government doesn't really appear to be what actually obtains at all. But then that's nested with all these other questions, why is that? How has that gotten wrong? Has it actually succeeded and it's failed? Has it been hijacked and it's failed? Has it been reformed and transformed in a way that's now supposed to succeed? There are all sorts of different perspectives.
Yeah, and how do you help, particularly with respect to the question of education? How do you help students understand the truth of that difference? Without hating their country, which is something else, which is something else that I've been accused of. But I think, being accused of that is the flip side of the curious of the idiosyncrasy in what Americans think it means to love our country. Right? I mean, do you remember back during the campaign season when J.D. Vance said that America is not an idea, it's a place, and the firestorm of controversy that created? I've actually been saying that for years, and it's on grounds. I mean, it's quite possibly that it's a place governed by a deeply flawed idea, actually, or an idea that's been corrupted in this or that or the other way. The idea, there's something really odd and surely somewhat historically unique in the notion that for an American to love his country is to love an idea, is to swear fealty to a certain periodized, a certain period of in the history of political philosophy, right? And I'm not sure where I'm going with that, other than to say that surely it seems to me that the task of responsibly educating young people so that they can see more truly into the nature of our society without hating it involves being able to recognize a difference between those two things and realize something of what I think is the tragic character of I mean, there is a fundamentally both great aspiration at the foundation of the American nation and a remarkable achievement. I mean, I love books that sort of detail the astonishment of the achievement of completing the American nation as a continental project in so short a period of time, right? Which is also, by the way, technologically aided and abetted. Particularly, I love, I'm really fascinated by the transcontinental railroad, the establishment of the telegraph, and those things. Without which, we might still be trying to get over the Rockies, or sail around the tip of South America without the Panama Canal. I mean, it's partially a technological achievement that we've done this. There is something obviously quite great, both about the ambition and the achievement, and yet arguably something tragic as well. That the very thing that has made us great is also the source of our undoing, or the source of our enthrallment and increasing enslavement to a system that actually looks very much like the opposite of what the founders may have intended, but that grows out of it. I liken the idea of you're getting blurry on me over there. I'm not sure what's going on. I think I may have written this in that Riley article that and I'm going to botch it, but the idea that you can't love your country without acknowledging this tragedy is like saying you can't love your mother and acknowledge she's an alcoholic at the same time. That's the way I tend to like to view it or think of it.
That
It's
opens up
distracting the fact that your camera's gone all.
It looks normal to me. It'll look normal, I think, in the end. But yeah, you're definitely right. There's I don't know how much you pay attention to the sort of new national developmentalists, the sort of like neo-Hamiltonian economist people who want to do industrial policy, and who look to like Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln's political economy, the Transcontinental Railroad, the Society for Useful Manufacturers, all of this stuff. But I find that stuff persuasive as far as policy.
By the way,
yes.
All of which, by the way, would be examples of Dewey's organized knowledge.
Well, I was just going to say that as like
endeavors would exemplify what he thinks is the sort of inherently progressive nature of a society founded on these kinds of Baconian premises, that it takes the form of that kind of cooperative endeavor. He's got this wonderful, for example, the idea that the great advances in shipbuilding that have taken place from the 19th and the 20th centuries mark not so much an improvement in intelligence as an improvement in society. So there is something. The answer to your question is that I paid very little attention to those people, and this is the first time I've ever actually heard the term that you've used to describe them. But what you're depicting is familiar, as on Deweyan grounds.
I was going to say not necessarily on Deweyan grounds, because I'm not actually, despite being an education major in college, I'm much less familiar with John Dewey. Mostly because I think I tried to stay away. Maybe I'll read them now and be illumined. But the Transcontinental Railroad and all of the Industrial Revolution wouldn't have been possible without this sort of technological impulse being at the sort of front and center of not only government policy, but of also a society that would allow it, or in which it could flower.
You're cutting way out. I can't hear you at all, and your picture has stopped.
That's not good. Can you hear me now?
But yeah, not only I did hear one bit though. Not only would it not be possible without the technological impulse, but the technological impulse would not come to fruition without the kind of social organization and cooperative endeavor. In a kind of what I sometimes call sort of artificial ecosystem of semi-directed activities. or semi-autonomous activities. The developments in forging of steel being somewhat separate from developments in electronic navigation, for example. But these two things come together. That illustrates, I think, the way in which a predominantly technological society necessarily has a social form. And this is what Dewey saw, and it's what he wanted to harness and direct, through ultimately government by expertise.
That makes sense. And can you hear me and see me again, by the way?
Yeah, you're better. You're
Oh,
better.
okay. I don't
I
know if
will tell
it's.
you a funny story about Dewey,
Oh, go ahead.
or at least experience with him. I actually was a real latecomer to discovering him, and I'd spent, you know, a decade or so, um, sort of trying to develop my own thought through engagement with primary sources and secondary commentary from early modern thought, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'd pretty much come to view things more or less the way that I view them now. When I found this little volume of lectures by Dewey called Reconstruction in Philosophy, written about 1910. And I read this, and pretty much everything that I had sort of labored, I felt my experience in reading this must have been like the experience of Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas, fighting their way across Helm's Deep, and under great travail, only to arrive at Isengard and discover Merry and Pippin sitting on a pile of rubble smoking pipeweed, without a care in the world. Because that's what it was like to come upon Dewey. All these things that I'd sort of labored to figure out, it was just there. He had done all the work. The difference is he liked it, and I didn't. And so if you're kind of struggling to put things together, I do think he's a very helpful. He very helpfully um, helps one to coalesce what you might be, fragments of thought that you're developing from this source or from that source, or bits of understanding that you've gotten here or there. I found it both frustrating for that reason, but also quite illuminating. And I've developed a real kind of uh, perverse affection for his thought, because I don't think it's profound. I don't think it's true. Beyond the sort of empirical level or true. It's true of the logic. It's not ontologically true. But it's been extraordinarily illuminating.
Yes. I think I said earlier we would close, but now I think I have one other point, which is the idea versus place debate, and this sort of idea of American patriotism. I read in college a few times actually. Alistair McIntyre, I think it was one of his Walgreen lectures. Is patriotism a virtue? I don't think, or it wasn't Walgreen. I think it was like one of his famous lectures at Kansas, University of Kansas. And he ends that essay, and he doesn't really give an answer to this, but he draws on something from Hegel, which is every society has their sort of customs or conventions, and they recognize how they're either derived from in some way or even separate from natural law proper. So if you think like in Plato's sense, there's the cave and then there's the sun. Every society is in a cave. And then there's the sun. And some societies more than others might recognize some connection between how the cave is constructed or how the cave is illumined and the sun itself. America is the only society that has ever tried to basically just bring the sun into the cave or to just like live outside of the cave under the sun directly. And that has always sat with me because I don't know what to do with that. McIntyre doesn't really do anything with it, at least in that lecture. Maybe in other lectures he picks it up, and I haven't read them. I don't know. But that might explain or be illustrative to this sort of idea versus place debate in the sense that this is like one version of American exceptionalism. We're the only place motivated by an idea, or think that it's the be all and end all for ideas. Does that make like, what do you?
Yeah,
I don't
that's
know.
That's really fascinating. I don't think I've ever read that lecture. I would have surely remembered that. It's a great image. Yeah, I mean, I might add to the ante here by recommending an essay that might be somewhat complimentary that I have gone back to years and over and over and over again. It's really um, uh, structured my thinking about this in a way. And it's an essay by George Grant, the Canadian philosopher who passed away in the 1980s, called "In Defense of North America." Um, and Grant, and the question that Grant is trying to get at, I mean, he begins with the idea, and I think he's right about this, um, that Europeans can't understand um, Americanness really. They can't recognize what they inevitably tend to regard America as a kind of Europe minus, and therefore miss the novelty, um, the historical novelty that America is, and he roots it in the radicality of the break, both the radicality of the break with the pre-modern thought world, right? I mean, and there's a wonderful line in this, I believe, on this score. It might be in Daniel Boorstin's Jefferson's America. It may be in another book. I don't remember. But the observation that um, the novelty of trying to bring enlightenment to a nation that had never experienced the Middle Ages, right? I mean, this I'm fascinated by the effect of the discovery of this continent on the European imagination, right? To discover a continent that seems to have been in some ways outside of history, or seems to have been not that far removed from the fall. A continent that also was a kind of tabula rasa for colonial intentions. It was just there. I mean, there were the native peoples, but their forms of organization were opaque to us, and seemed primitive to us relative to European civic and political structures. Um, and that all of this combines to make North America. He's writing about North America as a whole, but the U.S. in particular, um, historically quite novel, and arguably essentially liberal in a way that I mean, liberalism is a superimposition atop Europeanness, but for us, it's originary, right? And there's nothing really above or beyond or outside of the founding. I think this is one of the reasons why, actually, McIntyre's situation obtains. Why it is that to be an American and to be a patriotic American is to adhere to this idea, right? Because the idea constitutes us originally in a way that is not the case for older nations with a deep Greek and Catholic Christian past. Nations that did experience the Middle Ages and left that experience, inscribed permanently in the landscape. We don't have that at all. And I think it creates that also, and the fact that the break wasn't just intellectual; it was also, on Grant's terms, um, and this is probably one of the sources of this line of thought that I've tried to develop in several of these things. The idea that Baconianism was integral to our ability to live here, right? This encounter with a continent that was vast and, in comparison to Europe in many ways, lethal. Right? I mean, we have animals that will kill you. We have weather that will kill you. We have terrain that will kill you. This is a rough and rugged place that, in order to render it habitable, and in order to make the continent ours, required an enormous exertion in a very short period of time of the new kind of knowledge that Baconianism made possible. So you take the radicality of the intellectual break, and the radicality of just the break of having sailed the ocean and set up, colonies here. And Grant argues that this produces a novelty that the European mind is not conditioned to grasp. And it's the novelty of an essentially liberal, industrial, and technological nation. That it helps to account for a lot of what I think are sort of quintessentially homegrown pathologies. So anyhow, I don't know quite where that leaves us vis-a-vis McIntyre, except that what I intended all of that to be is a kind of elaboration of that point about the cave, or trying to, and I'm not speaking for him, obviously, but how I might understand something like that.
Well, I'm gonna have to go. That's so fascinating. Brings up. I mean, I feel like Tocqueville says some of the same things and then some of the opposite things. But I've already kept you for way too long, and I appreciate this very much, especially putting up with some of my, especially in the beginning there. Didn't know where to go with some of the things that you were saying, which is a little bit uncharacteristic of me. But thank you for putting up with it.
You.
No, I don't think so. This is the right. This is the work of education, is to mind bend a little bit in the right ways, hopefully. But again, yeah, I can't say thank you enough.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, I hope there's something in that that's useful to you. But in either event, it was great fun. I always enjoy talking with you, and I look forward to doing it again, whether on screen or over a pint somewhere.
That would be great. But if our listeners want to follow more of your work, what would you direct them to?
Google.
Okay.
I mean, my stuff is sort of scattered in the wind. I'm trying to pull some of the things that I've done and a few thoughts that I haven't yet fully coalesced into a couple of books, but those are probably a year or so from seeing the light of day. So, most of the articles that we've talked about are just floating around, First Things, New Polity, what have you, accessible through the internet, I think. So Communio, a theological journal, I've done some stuff in. But yeah, that stuff can be tracked down easily enough.
All right. Very good. Thanks again.
You bet. Take care, Tom.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.